Yeah, there's no basis in science for the vaccine mandates. Everybody needs to understand that. This is a political agenda, not a science agenda. This is not a public health measure. You've got people who are committed to this whole construct of centralized public health and control at a global level. You can call them the globalists, or I prefer to use the term centralists, people who dream of a world where everybody is on the same digital ID with their vaccination records contained in that digital ID and prohibited from doing all sorts of things if they aren't keeping their vaccine status up to date and maybe their social credit score. This has been had trial runs in China, and it's the direction of travel. These organizations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the World Bank, they're all in on this trajectory of moving towards control at a global level of individuals and their freedom of movement, expression, and bodily integrity. So there's a kind of, some people refer to it as an ideological trajectory. I don't see it as ideology. I see it as political agenda. There are people in the world who believe that centralization is the way to go. I believe that's absurd. There is no fact in political science that has been more demonstrably refuted more times than this idea that centralization can ever have positive benefits for humanity. It's a dreadful idea, and one that we all need to wake up to and work against.
Again, just to play devil's advocate, I definitely agree with you, but to play devil's advocate, there's probably an argument that they would make is that there's a lot of people in Africa that don't get vaccines that might be very helpful to them. Not perhaps the vaccine for COVID, but perhaps other vaccines. So if we do this, we might get them to get those vaccines, and it will help them.
Yeah, there is kind of like this cult-like belief that the vaccines are the panacea for public health problems. It's ridiculous. You know, the problems that people face in Africa are many, and what's happened is they've kind of zeroed in on pathogens. And this idea, which I refer to as pandemicity, the idea that there are going to be more and more frequent pandemics, that idea is false. The globalization and integration of the world leads to greater resistance to the outbreak of epidemics because we're basically sharing all the time the broadly circulating pathogens. Viruses have had plenty of time, billions of years, to occupy almost every niche in the planetary ecology. So this idea that they're going to be these completely novel viruses that are going to spring forth and cause everybody to start dying in large numbers is a flawed one. But that's part of the cult, the cult that places pathogens in this almost godlike kind of status, and vaccines as the holy grail of defending against pathogens. These people deny the existence of immune systems and the importance of general population well-being. They would rather shut down the world's economy than in the effort to get these vaccines into every arm on the planet, totally ignoring the huge public health ramifications of doing so, which would be much, much greater than the total disease burden of all the pathogens that we know about in the world. You know, communicable diseases are a problem in poor countries, but they aren't a problem in rich countries. And the reason they're not a problem in rich countries is the level of well-being is higher. And so shutting down economies makes no sense. It puts more people in the position of being vulnerable to communicable diseases because they don't have access to clean water and their economies are permanently on their knees. So you can forget about these people having an ounce of philanthropic goodwill towards humanity. They are bananas and they need to be seen that way. Gates, Fauci, Daszak, Barrick, all the gods of this story, Tedros, these people are simply nuts.
Most people now believe that the virus came from a lab in Wuhan. Do you think there's any possibility that this virus was deliberately created to be or deliberately unleashed on the world?
Yeah, there is definitely a possibility. I would say even a probability at this stage, but it's one that I kind of don't jump on the thing and go completely mad about it, because the there is still a chance that this thing is something that evolved and indeed could have been something that had been circulating for a longer time than we know. So the idea that emerged out of Wuhan in December 2019, I believe, has zero probability of being correct. That is not the case. This thing was definitely around before that. And, you know, I think what's kind of lost, people get too excitable about this whole genealogical analysis of viruses. You know, viruses are not these things that organize themselves into neat taxonomic categories. There's a kind of continuum, a spectrum of, you can speak about clusters of viruses that share similar properties. And so I think people tend to try and squash viruses into species and subspecies in the same way that we would maybe look at birds. Even the effort to put any kind of organism into a taxonomic structure is difficult, but with viruses, it's particularly difficult. And I think it leads to some very bad ways of thinking about the problems. So I would probably, if I had to place money on it on even odds, I would go with there having been at least lab passage, not necessarily a lab, a deliberate lab creation or lab leak, but at least some time spent in a lab. And but I would, you know, it would be that's kind of a strong hypothesis weakly held. If contradicting evidence came to light, I would change my mind.
Yeah, it's just strange to me that these virus testings were done in China, sponsored by the American government. I mean, it's a very strange thing to do.
Yeah, and you can see there's this history of academic papers where these guys are monkeying around with the spike protein in gain of function type work, and it's the same characters who are promoting the whole COVID policy response, the malarkey, as I like to refer to it, the craziness. It's the same scientists. It's, you know, to an extent you can see it in the Fauci emails where, you know, the smoking guns are there. Fauci gets told by his scientists, look, this thing looks like it has a lab origin, and then he acts very quickly to cover up that story and to get the fact checkers, who are these people who are actually fact deniers. When you see somebody claiming to be a fact checker, you need to know they are there to maintain a propaganda narrative, not to correct false statements. And the fact checkers get launched on anybody who's talking about a lab leak or lab origin. So Fauci, who had funded through EcoHealth Alliance the gain of function work in China, was desperate to cover the story up. He didn't want to be the one who'd been blamed for the release of a deadly pathogen, as they thought it was, on the world, you know, responsible for a global pandemic. So he covered it up. Man's a criminal. Let's not mince our words here.
So, Nick, a lot of people who are pushing a vaccine mandate like to say, I think it also Melania Verwoerd said this, that if we get the vaccine mandate, it will be back to normal, life back to normal. But yeah, I mean, we see in Portugal, we see in Gibraltar, where they have like a 90% vaccination rate. Life is not back to normal for them. So is that something that will happen?
Definitely not, especially now, you know, it's blamed on Omicron, but I think it could be fundamental to the vaccines. What we're seeing is what's known as negative efficacy. People who've been vaccinated are more likely to be infected by Omicron.
Really?
Yes, this has come out of a study, quite a large and substantial study out of Denmark in recent days. And if you look at what's happening with Omicron. Okay, so the first thing to understand is these vaccines, the mRNA vaccines, like the Pfizer vaccine, which is the one that's being administered to the general population in South Africa, and the Johnson & Johnson type vaccine, which are known as adenovirus vector vaccines. They both of those types of vaccines work on a tiny portion of the virus called the spike protein. So they only teach your body to recognize a mimic of the original spike protein portion. It's this tiny portion, 6 or 7%, I think, is the portion of the whole virus. Okay, so I just want to say that again. The vaccines are teaching your body to recognize a mimic of the original SARS-CoV-2. And what's happened with Omicron is all of the mutations, or not all of them, but almost all of them, are on the spike protein. And that is a sign of one of two things: either further lab tinkering or evolutionary pressure being exerted by the vaccines upon the virus. If you do any kind of response that you take, whether it's lockdown or any kind of medical intervention or any kind of immunization program, will place evolutionary pressure on the pathogen that you're trying to protect against. Any type of action. That's a truism of evolutionary theory. So when you go and vaccinate vast proportions of the population with this very narrow vaccine-induced immunity, you put evolutionary pressure on that part of the virus. So this is a predicted result, that you would end up with variants flourishing that evade the vaccines. And that's what's going on here, is that it's actually complicated by another problem, which is that because of their kind of very brute force nature, they cause the immune system to overreact and to produce a very narrow and exaggerated kind of response to that very small segment of the mimic of the pathogen. And there's a fairly substantial body of science showing that that inhibits the body from producing a broader natural response when a vaccinated person is infected. So if that's true, and if that's a very strong kind of observation, then what vaccinated people can expect is that they'll get reinfected more often than a naturally immune person who hasn't been vaccinated will.